Welcome to another spine-tingling installment of the Boring Files series. Protocol requires that you like, subscribe, and perform any other meaningless digital rituals before we begin. Skipping this step will not affect your health, but it will make the algorithm angry. Tonight's subject is medieval science, also known as whatever Aristotle said, but with more leeches. This was an age where the most advanced medical advice was, bleed first, ask questions later. Scholars copied dusty manuscripts with such reverence that even obvious nonsense, like women supposedly having fewer teeth than men, was carefully preserved for centuries. You will learn why physicians sniffed sewage to ward off plague, why narwhal tusks were sold as unicorn horns, and why some people genuinely believed salamanders could live quite comfortably in fire. Confidence was high. Evidence did not exist. Over the next 2 hours, we'll be examining some beliefs in excessive detail and in the exact style of a medieval textbook, confident, wrong, and surprisingly long. By the end, you'll know exactly what medieval science looked like, and why you should be glad it isn't still in charge. This is what medieval scientists actually believed. Among the more persistent beliefs of the medieval world was that unicorn horns held the power to neutralize poison. This was not a fringe superstition whispered in rural villages. It was a conviction held by physicians, nobles, and merchants across Europe. The logic was elegantly simple. Unicorns were rare, pure, and associated with virgin maidens in tapestries, therefore their horns must be good at something. Why not curing poison? The real issue was, of course, the unicorns. They had a frustrating habit of not existing. Fortunately, nature provided a substitute in the form of narwhals. Traders from the north brought long, spiraled tusks from these Arctic whales, and European merchants immediately rebranded them as unicorn horns. They fetched enormous sums. Kings purchased them as protective charms, apothecaries ground shavings into powders, and goblets carved from the tusks were advertised as foolproof insurance against assassination attempts. One 16th century cup was valued higher than a castle, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval priorities. Doctors and scholars treated the matter with complete seriousness. Medical texts calmly explained how the horn neutralized toxins, though they avoided the small technicality of explaining how one might verify such claims without fatally poisoning the patient. Accounts circulated of rulers dipping the horn into drinks to test them, after which the monarch would confidently drink, survive, and consider the experiment a success. The fact that most wine was not poisoned to begin with did little to undermine the reputation of the horn. Unicorn horns also migrated into the world of pharmacy. Apothecaries sold slivers of tusk as antidotes for venomous bites, stomach ailments, and the occasional case of excessive melancholy. The powders were rare enough to be mixed with other more affordable substances, such as chalk or bone dust, but since the horn supposedly worked in mysterious ways, customers were none the wiser. People were reassured by the price tag. If it was expensive, surely it had to work. The belief even extended to public ceremony. At royal banquets, unicorn horns were displayed with as much pride as the main course. Guests were reminded that they were drinking safely under the horn's protection, which no doubt helped the wine go down. Whether this reassurance had a measurable medical effect is questionable, but it certainly prevented awkward silences at the table. Don't worry, the unicorn has it covered, was the medieval equivalent of FDA approved. Modern readers may wonder why no one questioned the supply chain. If unicorns were as elusive as everyone claimed, why did merchants have a steady surplus of horns? The answer is that asking questions was not the medieval method. Authority was everything. If a scholar said unicorn horns cured poison and a merchant supplied the horns, then the matter was considered closed. Besides, there was little incentive to debunk a product that was protecting kings, enriching traders, and giving apothecaries something exotic to grind into powder. Thus, the unicorn horn remained a staple of medieval science, part medical device, part luxury good, and part fantasy novel brought to life. It encapsulated the era's approach to knowledge, confident, expensive, and based entirely on things nobody bothered to verify. If unicorn horns represented the exotic side of medieval science, the next belief highlights something closer to home, literally inside the mouth. Aristotle, the ever-trusted authority, confidently asserted that women had fewer teeth than men. Generations of medieval scholars copied the statement into their medical texts without question. No experiments were conducted, no mouths were counted, and certainly no wives were asked to participate in an informal survey. The claim persisted, not because it made sense, but because Aristotle had written it, and Aristotle was rarely contradicted. To a modern mind, the test seems embarrassingly simple. Line up a man, line up a woman, and count. Yet the act of counting teeth apparently did not occur to anyone for several centuries. This was partly cultural. Scientific credibility was based on deference to authority, not empirical observation. If the great philosopher of Athens had written something down, it was presumed to be accurate, even when the evidence was available at the end of one's dinner table. Medical manuals of the period repeated the assertion as if it were an anatomical fact. The difference in tooth count was sometimes linked to broader theories about women being biologically weaker, less complete, or otherwise defective versions of men, a perspective that neatly aligned with prevailing social hierarchies. Teeth, in this context, were not merely dental structures. They were further proof that women were subordinate by nature. At least, that was the reasoning. The actual teeth remained uncounted. The belief occasionally found its way into sermons and moral lessons. Preachers would reference the supposed dental deficiency as evidence of woman's place in the cosmic order. The lesson was clear. Men had more of everything, even in their mouths. Audiences nodded along, apparently unconcerned that their own wives, daughters, and mothers seemed perfectly capable of chewing through a loaf of bread with all the teeth necessary. The reluctance to verify Aristotle's claim may also reflect the practical realities of medieval life. Dental hygiene was poor, diets were rough on enamel, and tooth loss was common across the population. By the time someone reached middle age, the actual number of teeth in any given jaw could vary dramatically. In that sense, perhaps Aristotle's observation matched the reality of some people he knew. Still, even a cursory glance at younger subjects would have exposed the flaw in the generalization. But a cursory glance was apparently outside the curriculum. This peculiar oversight illustrates a broader theme of medieval science, the triumph of authority over evidence. The point was not to observe nature directly, but to preserve and repeat what had already been written. To question Aristotle was not merely to raise a scientific objection, it was to risk undermining the very foundation of learned tradition. For most scholars, that was unthinkable. Better to assume women really did have fewer teeth than to risk contradicting the ancient master. In the end, the theory stood for centuries, not because it was true, but because it was written in ink and copied faithfully by generations of scribes. As a result, medieval science managed to overlook one of the simplest experiments in history: opening one's mouth and counting. It was a small oversight with large symbolic weight, proof that in this era, confidence could substitute entirely for accuracy. The medieval approach to health extended well beyond anatomy and often into the air itself. When plague and pestilence swept through towns, scholars and physicians assured the public that the culprit was not invisible germs, but foul-smelling vapors. This idea, known as miasma theory, insisted that disease spread through corrupted air. The logical countermeasure was therefore straightforward: surround oneself with even worse odors to drive the poison away. As a result, medieval Europe became a gallery of dubious aromatherapy. People carried small pouches of herbs, pressed posies to their faces, and stuffed flowers into their clothing. Wealthier households burned fragrant woods or scattered spices around rooms, a practice that at least made the home smell marginally better, if not actually safer. At the same time, less elegant methods were also attempted. Some physicians advised inhaling sewage fumes, the rationale being that one form of corruption might cancel out another. The patient was expected to hold their nose over a privy or wander near a dung heap, taking deep medicinal breaths. There is little evidence that this practice worked, though it did effectively guarantee social distancing. Protective gear was developed with the same principle in mind. The famous plague doctor mask, with its long bird-like beak, was essentially an early air filter. The cavity of the mask was packed with herbs, vinegar-soaked sponges, or occasionally tobacco smoke, all intended to purify the air before it reached the lungs. The appearance may seem sinister today, but in context it was simply another way of weaponizing scent. The doctor believed he was carrying a portable garden against corruption, while the patient believed they were being treated by an unusually tall bird. The obsession with smell even extended to urban policy. Towns introduced ordinances requiring the cleaning of streets, not out of concern for sanitation as we understand it, but because foul odors were assumed to generate illness. Rakers were hired to cart away waste, cesspits were regulated, and butchers were sometimes forced to operate outside city walls. These measures occasionally improved hygiene by accident, though the credit went to the absence of stench rather than the removal of bacteria. For the ordinary person, however, the strategy was improvisational. A poor villager without access to exotic herbs might resort to carrying garlic, vinegar, or even rotting onions as protective charms. The thinking was consistent. As long as something smelled bad, it must be doing its job. Children were encouraged to wear strong-smelling trinkets, travelers doused themselves in pungent oils, and entire households reeked of folk remedies. One chronicler noted that the air in some towns became so heavily perfumed during outbreaks that simply walking the streets felt like moving through a marketplace of competing odors. The persistence of this belief demonstrates how theory and practice intersected in the medieval world. Without microscopes or germ theory, smell was the most obvious indicator of corruption, and people acted accordingly. Whether it was a sack of roses, a pocketful of garlic, or the aromatic fumes of sewage, the goal remained the same: outstink the plague. Modern medicine eventually abandoned the notion, but the idea that bad smells equal bad health still lingers faintly in everyday life. Few people today would claim to believe in miasma, yet most still wrinkle their noses instinctively when entering a musty room, as if some medieval instinct persists. The difference, of course, is that we now open a window, rather than hold our faces over the nearest cesspit. Among the more ambitious pursuits of medieval science was the quest for the philosopher's stone, an object said to transform base metals into gold and grant eternal life. Alchemists devoted lifetimes to this search, and entire libraries were filled with recipes, diagrams, and philosophical commentaries, promising that success was just one more furnace experiment away. To the modern reader, it might sound like an elaborate treasure hunt. To the medieval practitioner, it was simply another day at work. Alchemical laboratories dotted the towns of Europe. These were often dimly lit rooms cluttered with furnaces, bellows, alembics, and jars of mysterious powders. The atmosphere was less scientific breakthrough and more kitchen experiment gone wrong. Yet the men in charge wore the mantle of scholars, claiming that their work was not about greed, but about uncovering the hidden harmonies of the universe. Of course, the promise of limitless gold probably didn't hurt their motivation. Manuscripts on the subject rarely gave straightforward instructions. Instead, they described cryptic operations in symbolic language. The green lion devouring the sun, the red king marrying the white queen, or the phoenix rising from its ashes. These allegories were supposed to guide the faithful seeker. In practice, they mostly produced confusion. One can only imagine the frustration of an apprentice trying to decode whether feed the dragon meant adding sulfur to the crucible or simply stoking the fire. The obsession with the philosopher's stone was not confined to obscure scholars. Monarchs and nobles often sponsored alchemists in the hope of filling their treasuries. Courts hosted these men, providing resources and protection in exchange for the faint chance of striking metaphysical gold. Rulers facing wars and debt were particularly enthusiastic. It is hard to imagine a more compelling sales pitch than just a few more experiments, and we can pay off the army with one ingot. Some alchemists genuinely believed in their craft, while others were more entrepreneurial. A few became notorious for producing small amounts of gold-like material through sleight of hand, keeping their patrons convinced that success was close. As long as the illusion held, the funds kept flowing. The line between science, philosophy, and fraud was often thin and sometimes entirely invisible. Despite the lofty promises, alchemy did stumble onto useful discoveries. Distillation, acids, and new alloys emerged as byproducts of failed attempts to create gold. Even the laboratory methods, heating, grinding, mixing, would later inform the development of chemistry. In this way, the pursuit of the impossible accidentally advanced the possible. It was, in effect, a very inefficient research grant system, but it produced results all the same. From the perspective of the medieval scholar, the philosopher's stone represented more than just material wealth. It was a symbol of perfection, a reflection of divine order, and a way to unify the physical and the spiritual. From the perspective of their patrons, however, it was a hoped-for shortcut to paying the bills. The difference in priorities rarely caused tension, as long as both parties pretended the furnace might produce results eventually. The stone, of course, was never found. Generations of alchemists grew old at their benches, writing ever more elaborate allegories while their furnaces consumed wood and patience. What they did leave behind was a peculiar legacy, a mix of failed gold-making, mystical diagrams, and the occasional useful chemical process. In short, the philosopher's stone was never discovered, but the idea itself proved strangely durable. Much like the experiments, it refused to die, smouldering in manuscripts long after the smoke had cleared. Few creatures in the medieval bestiary enjoyed a reputation as dramatic as the salamander. To modern readers, it is a small amphibian, usually damp and rather unremarkable. To medieval scholars, however, it was nothing less than the embodiment of fire's mystery. Texts confidently declared that the salamander not only survived flames, but thrived in them. The animal was thought to emerge from hearths and forges, perfectly comfortable among the embers. Writers from antiquity had planted the seed of this idea, and medieval authors eagerly copied it forward. Pliny the Elder described salamanders extinguishing flames merely by their presence, and later commentators expanded the tale. The creature became a symbol of resistance, purity, and sometimes even virtue, surviving in conditions that destroyed everything else. This made it irresistible to medieval imagination, where natural philosophy often blurred into allegory. Bestiaries illustrated the salamander in vivid detail. Some depicted it as a lizard, others as a worm, and a few as something closer to a small dragon. In each case, the defining trait was its invulnerability to fire. Students reading these works were not expected to question whether anyone had actually placed a salamander in a flame and watched the result. It was far easier to assume the creature obeyed the natural order as described in the text, which in this case meant ignoring the obvious problem of amphibians and heat. Practical demonstrations were rare, but the legend persisted in households. A common story held that salamander fur could be woven into cloth that resisted burning. Of course, salamanders do not possess fur, a detail that failed to trouble the imagination of those eager to believe. Fabrics from Asia made of asbestos were sometimes passed off as salamander wool to eager European buyers. Owners would show off by tossing a garment into the fire and then retrieving it intact, proof that the salamander's gift had been captured in textile form. The belief extended into symbolism. For alchemists, the salamander represented the transformative power of fire, linking it neatly with their furnace-driven experiments. For moralists, it symbolized purity enduring in the flames of temptation. For royalty, it was a convenient emblem of resilience and power. Francis I of France even adopted the salamander as his personal badge, accompanied by the motto, "I nourish the good and extinguish the bad." Whether or not the king understood the zoology was irrelevant. The imagery was too useful to resist. From a modern standpoint, the persistence of the idea is easier to explain. Salamanders do live in damp places, under logs, in cool earth, and near streams. When firewood containing one of these creatures was tossed into a hearth, it would scramble out of the flames, soaked and smoking, seemingly unscathed. To a medieval onlooker, this was not evidence of a lucky escape, but proof of a magical nature. The fact that most salamanders did not survive such events was politely overlooked. In the end, the salamander in fire reveals the medieval blend of observation, imagination, and allegory. A handful of sightings combined with inherited authority became a scientific fact repeated for centuries. The salamander was not just a lizard. It was a philosophical statement, a textile brand, and a royal emblem. That it also happened to be highly flammable was of little concern. Long before microscopes or modern biology, medieval medicine explained the human body with a model borrowed from antiquity, the theory of the four humours. According to this framework, every person was governed by four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance, illness meant imbalance. It was an elegant system on parchment, less so in practice. Textbooks devoted entire chapters to the qualities of each humour. Blood was associated with warmth and moisture, phlegm with cold and dampness, yellow bile with heat and dryness, and black bile with cold and dryness. From these neat categories sprang a catalogue of diagnoses. Too cheerful, you had an excess of blood. Too sluggish, blame phlegm. Melancholy, black bile was to blame, even though nobody had actually seen it. In this way, every possible mood or symptom was tidily accounted for by one fluid or another. The influence of the humours extended well beyond the physician's bench. Diet, exercise, and even personality were framed through the lens of bodily fluids. A man prone to anger was deemed choleric, dominated by yellow bile. The thoughtful but gloomy scholar was considered melancholic, weighed down by black bile. A healthy complexion indicated sanguine balance, while a runny nose was not just a nuisance, but a diagnostic insight into one's phlegmatic nature. It was medicine, philosophy, and horoscope rolled into one, and it dominated European thought for centuries. Treatments followed the same logic. Physicians prescribed diets tailored to rebalance the fluids, or advised specific seasons for certain activities. More drastic measures, such as bloodletting, were reserved for cases of severe imbalance. Leeches were applied, veins were opened, and patients reassured that their malaise was literally draining away. For the record, many did not feel better afterward, but the important thing was that the physician had followed the theory faithfully. Humoral theory also shaped wider culture. Writers used it to explain character types in plays, theologians linked it to moral states, and astrologers matched it to planetary influences. In effect, the four humours served as a universal key to unlock every human riddle. The fact that the key did not fit the lock rarely troubled its users. Authority mattered more than accuracy, and the humours had the full weight of Galen and Aristotle behind them. From a modern perspective, the appeal of the system is easy to understand. It was comprehensive, easy to memorize, and adaptable to any circumstance. A physician facing an unusual case could simply declare a rare imbalance between humours, and the theory remained intact. No experiment could truly disprove it, because the framework could bend to accommodate every possible outcome. In that sense, it was the perfect medical model for an age that prized certainty above evidence. The four humours survived into the Renaissance and lingered well beyond, a testament to how long a simple idea can outlast its usefulness. For medieval science, it was not just a medical theory, it was the foundation upon which nearly every diagnosis, treatment, and personality judgment was built. In the end, it was less about fluids and more about confidence, a tidy diagram that made the world seem orderly, even when it wasn't. Once the theory of humours had established that imbalance caused illness, medieval medicine needed a practical way to restore equilibrium. The answer was remarkably consistent: remove some blood. Whether the patient complained of fever, headache, stomach pain, or general melancholy, the physician's reflex was to reach for the lancet or the leech. Bloodletting was considered the most direct way to adjust the body's internal proportions. Manuals instructed physicians on which veins to open depending on the ailment. Pain in the head? Target the veins near the temple. Trouble in the liver? Open a vein in the arm. General unease? Almost any vein would do. Charts illustrated the human body with tidy diagrams showing where to cut, as though the patient were little more than a wineskin needing adjustment. Leeches offered a slower, less dramatic alternative. Apothecaries kept jars filled with the creatures, and physicians applied them to patients with the confidence of someone delivering state-of-the-art care. The leech's steady work was thought to be more refined than the knife, ideal for delicate cases. In reality, it was simply another way of removing blood, though with the added inconvenience of keeping worms in the medical kit. The practice was not reserved for the sick. Preventative bloodletting was common, on the theory that drawing off a little excess fluid now could forestall serious illness later. Wealthy patrons scheduled seasonal bleedings as part of their routine, much like modern checkups. The difference, of course, is that today a doctor might order blood tests, whereas in the medieval world, the doctor simply took the blood and declared the matter settled. Hospitals institutionalized the custom. Records show patients bled on arrival, regardless of their condition. It was a standardized treatment, efficient in its consistency if not in its results. Some monasteries even included bloodletting in their calendars, timing the procedure with the seasons and the phases of the moon. The logic was that the cosmos itself influenced the humors, and cutting at the wrong time could do more harm than good. For patients, this meant that illness had to wait until the astrologer gave approval. Despite its risks, bloodletting endured because it matched the theory perfectly. Every symptom could be traced back to excess blood, and every cure began with its removal. When patients recovered, credit went to the procedure. When they declined, physicians concluded that the imbalance had simply been too severe, and the system remained unchallenged. In this way, bloodletting became both the first and last resort, a universal solution that conveniently required no revision of medical theory. The results were mixed, though not entirely useless. For conditions like high blood pressure or certain fevers, losing blood could produce short-term relief, giving the appearance of success. For most other ailments, however, the treatment left patients weaker, poorer, and often more skeptical of their recovery. Still, skepticism rarely outweighed tradition. Doctors had learned the method from their masters, who had learned it from theirs, and so the practice continued with unwavering confidence. In retrospect, bloodletting demonstrates the remarkable durability of a bad idea. It was logical within the framework of humoral theory, reinforced by authority, and simple to perform. Its very simplicity was part of its appeal. One method, many illnesses, minimal thought required. It remained a cornerstone of medical practice well into the modern era, proof that once a treatment becomes tradition, it is very difficult to dislodge. Medieval anatomy was built on the writings of Galen, a physician from the Roman world, whose work remained authoritative for more than 1,000 years. Galen's problem was access. He was not allowed to dissect human cadavers, so most of his anatomical observations came from animals. Pigs, monkeys, and the occasional goat provided his models, and their organs were confidently mapped onto the human body. The result was a set of diagrams that looked persuasive on parchment, but did not quite match the reality of human physiology. One of Galen's enduring errors concerned the structure of the heart. His text described it as having 3 chambers rather than 4. This design made perfect sense to his medieval readers, who copied the diagrams with care, illuminated the pages with gold leaf, and never thought to question the accuracy of the source. The heart, after all, was not something one could casually inspect. Dissection of human bodies was rare, often forbidden, and always controversial. It was much easier to trust the authority of antiquity than to seek direct confirmation. The three-chambered heart supported other parts of medieval theory. Physicians believed that blood was manufactured in the liver, passed through the heart for heating, and then distributed throughout the body. The chambers in this scheme worked less as pumps and more as furnaces. The heart was a stove, not a machine, keeping the body warm and spirited. Diagrams showed arrows representing flows of blood and vital spirits, though how these flows operated was largely theoretical. Medical students memorized the descriptions faithfully. Lectures often involved professors reading Galen's text aloud while pointing to diagrams on a board, the medieval equivalent of PowerPoint slides. Dissection, when it occurred, was sometimes limited to animals, with the professor seated on a high chair explaining the text, while an assistant performed the messy work below. In cases where reality contradicted the textbook, the specimen was assumed to be abnormal. The book could not be wrong. This unquestioned acceptance occasionally produced odd contradictions. Patients with chest wounds, for example, sometimes revealed more than 3 compartments in the heart. Instead of revising the theory, doctors explained away the discrepancy as a strange variation. Nature, they reasoned, occasionally produced unusual specimens. The thought that Galen might have been mistaken was far more unsettling than the idea that nature had produced another anomaly. The prestige of Galen's writings ensured the error endured well into the Renaissance. Only when systematic human dissections became more common did the 4-chambered heart finally replace the older model. Even then, resistance lingered. Scholars who had built careers on explaining Galenic anatomy were reluctant to concede that centuries of lectures had been based on a miscount. It was easier to suggest that new observations required subtle reinterpretations of the old master's work than to declare him outright wrong. The 3-chambered heart thus stands as a symbol of medieval science's relationship with authority. Knowledge was not something to be tested, but something to be preserved. A single man's careful but limited observations became the bedrock of medical understanding for generations. That the model did not fit human reality was less important than the fact that it fit the intellectual framework of the time. In the end, the heart was not seen as a muscle tirelessly pumping blood, but as a mystical furnace sustaining life. The mistake endured not because it was convincing, but because it was traditional. And in the medieval world, tradition often carried more weight than truth. In medieval medicine, the night's sleep was more than rest. It was also a diagnostic tool. Physicians believed that dreams offered direct insight into the state of the body. A troubling dream was rarely blamed on a bad dinner or an overactive imagination. Instead, it was treated as a clinical report from the subconscious, a kind of medical chart scribbled onto the mind. Medical manuals included entire sections on dream interpretation. A dream of fire might indicate an excess of heat in the body, perhaps too much yellow bile. Dreams of water suggested coldness and phlegm. Seeing blood in one's sleep could mean the humours were shifting, while nightmares of falling pointed toward imbalance or weakness. The dreams did not need to make sense as stories. Their value lay in the symbols, which could be slotted neatly into the framework of humoral theory. Doctors recorded cases where patients arrived describing bizarre visions. One might report dreaming of a lion, which could be translated as excessive heat in the liver. Another might dream of snow, indicating too much cold moisture. The physician's job was not to question why lions and snow were appearing in the same landscape, but to prescribe an appropriate course of treatment, change the diet, adjust the season's regimen, or, when in doubt, draw blood. Astrological influences were often layered on top of these interpretations. Dreams occurring under certain planetary alignments carried more weight. A nightmare during a Mars-dominated night could be taken as a sign of aggressive humoral imbalance, while a vision under Venus might point toward conditions of the reproductive organs. To the medieval mind, the night sky, the body, and the subconscious were all part of one continuous system. The practice also made its way into popular belief. Ordinary people interpreted their own dreams with equal seriousness. A dream of teeth falling out, for instance, was considered a bad omen for health or family fortune. Seeing animals in dreams might be taken as a warning of illness in livestock. In each case, the boundary between medical insight and folk superstition blurred, leaving dream interpretation as a tool used both in the doctor's study and the village square. Of course, the reliability of these diagnoses was questionable. Dreams are by nature inconsistent. A patient who dreamed of fire one week and water the next left the physician juggling contradictory reports. But contradiction was rarely a problem in medieval science. Both dreams could be incorporated into a diagnosis of shifting humors, conveniently reinforcing the physician's authority. From the patient's perspective, the system at least provided an explanation for the unexplainable. Nightmares were frightening, and the promise that they revealed something specific about the body was reassuring. Better to believe that a terrifying dream of falling indicated a minor imbalance than to accept it as meaningless chaos. In that sense, the method offered comfort, even if it did not always deliver cures. Dreams as diagnostics remained a staple of medieval medicine for centuries. They required no equipment, no cadavers, and no costly ingredients, only a willingness to listen and interpret. For the physician, they offered an endless supply of clues. For the patient, they made sense of troubling visions. And for modern readers, they reveal yet another example of medieval confidence in systems that explained everything, even the random images of sleep. A sneeze in the medieval world was more than a bodily reflex. It was an event that demanded attention, interpretation, and sometimes even ritual. Scholars and lay people alike believed that sneezing expelled harmful spirits or noxious vapors from the body. In an age when unseen forces explained nearly everything, the violent burst of air from the nose was taken as visible proof that something intangible had just been ejected. Texts described sneezing as the body's way of purging corruption. Physicians linked the act to excess humors seeking escape, while theologians added a spiritual dimension. Evil spirits, disturbed by the sneeze, were forced out of the body. The dramatic force of the event, complete with noise, spittle, and an unmistakable jolt of the head, seemed to support the idea that more than air was leaving the system. Cultural reactions reinforced the belief. The habit of saying "God bless you" after a sneeze, still alive today, was rooted in medieval concern that the act left the body momentarily vulnerable. Blessings were considered a shield against opportunistic spirits attempting to rush back in. In some regions, elaborate responses developed. A single sneeze might be greeted with one blessing, 2 sneezes with an extended prayer, and 3 in a row with a level of concern usually reserved for plague symptoms. Medical advice often included recommendations for managing sneezing. Strong herbs such as pepper or mustard were suggested to provoke sneezes deliberately, the idea being that it was better to expel harmful vapors on schedule than to wait for them to accumulate. Manuals described sneezing powders designed to encourage regular expulsions, not unlike modern attempts at preventive medicine. The patient who sneezed regularly was considered healthier, or at least better ventilated, than the one who did not. Astrological theories also crept into the discussion. A sneeze occurring under certain planetary alignments might be seen as a good omen, while under others it could be interpreted as a warning. The stars and the nose worked in tandem, offering yet another way for medieval science to tie every phenomenon into a broader cosmic system. For the common person, sneezing carried social meaning as well. It could be taken as a sign of truthfulness, enthusiasm, or even divine favor. Chroniclers occasionally noted important figures sneezing at key moments, interpreting it as an omen that events were unfolding as they should. The simple act of clearing the nasal passages became a minor contribution to historical destiny. Of course, there were downsides. Excessive sneezing could be viewed as evidence of imbalance or impending illness. A person unable to stop sneezing might be suspected of harboring deeper corruption, spiritual or otherwise. Remedies included binding the head with cloth, inhaling vinegar fumes, or once again, bleeding. Nothing says comprehensive treatment plan, quite like answering every symptom with a lancet. What is striking in retrospect is how a simple reflex was woven into the grand tapestry of medieval explanation. A sneeze was never just a sneeze. It was medical evidence, spiritual drama, and social ritual all rolled into one. Modern science reduces it to dust particles and irritated membranes, but in the medieval imagination, each sneeze was a miniature exorcism, accompanied by blessings and a firm conviction that unseen forces had just been expelled through the nose. Medieval astronomy was dominated by a model of the universe that placed Earth firmly in the middle. Known as the Ptolemaic system, it imagined the planet as the unmoving hub around which everything else revolved. The sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. The notion was not a casual suggestion, but an intellectual cornerstone, repeated in textbooks, sermons, and university lectures with unwavering confidence. The logic seemed obvious. To the naked eye, the heavens clearly moved across the sky each day, while the ground beneath one's feet stayed reassuringly still. It was far easier to conclude that the cosmos turned around Earth than to suggest that Earth itself was spinning. The system also carried a certain comforting symbolism. Humanity, perched at the center, could believe itself positioned exactly where divine order intended. To make this arrangement work, medieval astronomers described the heavens as a set of nested crystal spheres. Each planet had its own transparent shell, which rotated at a steady pace, carrying the celestial body along its path. The outermost sphere held the fixed stars, creating a glittering dome that turned as one unit. The result was elegant in design and extremely difficult to challenge, since nobody could reach the heavens to check. Complications arose when planets behaved badly. Mars, for example, had the audacity to move backward at times, creating retrograde motion. To explain this, astronomers invented epicycles, smaller circles that planets traced while traveling on their larger orbital circles. The mathematics grew increasingly elaborate, but the principle remained intact. Earth was in the middle, and everything else bent to accommodate that fact. The universe might look messy, but with enough circles drawn on parchment, order could always be restored. This cosmic arrangement was taught not just as astronomy, but as theology. The Earth's central position was described as fitting for a world of corruption and decay, while the heavens, made of pure and incorruptible matter, revolved in perfect harmony above. Students were instructed that the very design of the cosmos reinforced Christian doctrine. Humanity lived at the center of creation, and the spheres testified to divine craftsmanship. For the general population, the model filtered into daily life through calendars and religious instruction. Church feasts were set according to celestial events, and the movement of the sun and moon dictated everything from planting to fasting. Nobody questioned whether the earth itself moved. Such a suggestion would have been regarded as both absurd and possibly heretical. The stability of the ground was too persuasive, and the authority of ancient texts too heavy to contradict. In hindsight, the model was ingenious in its persistence. For over a millennium, it held sway across Europe, supported by scholars, clergy, and monarchs alike. Even when observations began to strain the system, the framework endured. To question it was not just to dispute astronomy, but to unsettle an entire world view. The cost of doubt was high, and so the universe dutifully revolved around Earth on parchment, regardless of what the heavens themselves were doing. The Earth at the center is thus a perfect example of medieval science at work, visually convincing, theologically convenient, mathematically complicated, and ultimately wrong. Yet in its wrongness, it provided stability, a sense that the cosmos was ordered and comprehensible, even if that order required ever more circles to keep it spinning smoothly. Having placed Earth securely at the center of the universe, medieval astronomy added another layer of refinement. The heavens themselves were believed to be flawless. The moon, the sun, and the planets were described as perfect, smooth, and incorruptible bodies, untouched by the blemishes and decay that plagued the earthly realm. In this view, the cosmos was divided neatly between the corrupt world below the moon and the unchanging perfection above it. This conviction was more than aesthetic preference. It was anchored in philosophy and theology. Aristotle had argued that celestial bodies were made of a special substance, ether, distinct from the four earthly elements. Ether did not change, burn, or rot. It moved only in perfect circles, the most noble of all motions. Medieval scholars absorbed these ideas and repeated them in their own commentaries, often with the embellishment that such perfection was fitting for the heavens, where God's order was most fully expressed. Illustrations in manuscripts reinforced the idea. Artists depicted the moon as a luminous disk, radiant and unmarred, while planets shone with untroubled clarity. The occasional dark patch glimpsed on the lunar surface was explained away as an optical illusion or as atmospheric interference. No one was eager to suggest that the moon itself might have flaws. Theologically, that would have been awkward. This framework created complications whenever natural phenomena disrupted the illusion. Eclipses, for instance, were a challenge. How could a perfect celestial body be darkened? Scholars solved the problem with geometry, explaining the temporary shadow as the Earth's interruption of otherwise unblemished light. Meteor showers and comets were even more troublesome, since they suggested change in the supposedly unchanging heavens. To preserve the doctrine of celestial perfection, these were categorized as atmospheric events, vapors igniting in the upper air, not true heavenly objects. In this way, the sky remained untarnished, even when it was clearly misbehaving. The belief in perfect orbs shaped medieval cosmology in practical ways. Astrologers, for example, cast horoscopes under the assumption that the planets moved in unbroken harmony, their positions predictable because they were free from imperfection. The whole system depended on the heavens remaining orderly. A flawed moon or a blemished planet would have disrupted not only the charts, but also the philosophical foundation that tied the cosmos to divine order. For ordinary people, the message filtered down in sermons and stories. The contrast between a corruptible earth and flawless heavens was used as a moral lesson. Life on earth was temporary and blemished, while eternity in heaven promised perfection. The stars themselves became theological props, glowing reminders that decay was not the final word. Nobody wanted to think too hard about why the moons sometimes appeared patchy, especially when their priest had already told them it was a symbol of purity. The smooth celestial spheres remained unquestioned until the early modern period. Only when telescopes revealed mountains and craters on the moon did the illusion finally collapse. By then, centuries of scholars had invested their authority in the perfection of the heavens, making the correction all the more painful. To admit that the moon was pockmarked was to concede that medieval cosmology had been not only mistaken, but profoundly misguided. The idea of perfect celestial orbs demonstrates the remarkable persistence of a simple belief. It was neat, it was reassuring, and it was consistent with theology. Whether or not it matched the sky was a secondary matter. The heavens were perfect because they had to be, and that was more than enough to keep the theory alive for centuries. The image of flawless spheres circling above was persuasive, but it left one recurring problem streaking across the sky: comets. Unlike the sun and planets, these visitors did not behave predictably. They appeared suddenly, burned brightly, and vanished without explanation. In a worldview that prized permanence and harmony, comets were disruptive intruders. The solution was to downgrade them from heavenly bodies to atmospheric disturbances. Scholars argued that comets were not objects in space at all, but vapors rising from the Earth. These vapors collected in the upper air, ignited, and briefly produced fiery trails. Once the vapors burned away, the comet disappeared, restoring cosmic order. This explanation allowed the heavens to remain perfect and unchanged, while blaming the Earth for any unsightly celestial fireworks. It was, in effect, a medieval version of nothing to see here. Medical writers joined the discussion by linking comets to disease. The burning vapors, they reasoned, corrupted the air, spreading illness to those unfortunate enough to breathe it in. A bright comet could therefore serve as advance notice of plague, famine, or other calamity. Chronicles often recorded comets alongside disasters, not as coincidence, but as cause and effect. To medieval readers, the pattern seemed obvious. Whenever a comet appeared, something unpleasant followed. Theologians added their own interpretations. A comet might signal divine anger, a warning that sinful behavior had reached intolerable levels. Preachers pointed to the blazing sky as proof that repentance was urgent. In this way, comets functioned as both meteorological events and moral billboards, their fiery trails urging humanity to reconsider its choices. The fact that comets appeared at irregular intervals only enhanced their power. Predictability belonged to the planets. Comets, by contrast, embodied divine spontaneity. Among ordinary people, comets carried a similar sense of foreboding. A bright streak across the sky could be taken as a sign of impending war or the death of a king. Rumors spread quickly, linking the phenomenon to local anxieties. Farmers worried about failed harvests, soldiers worried about campaigns, and rulers worried about their thrones. In each case, the comet was interpreted less as a natural object and more as a personalized omen, as though the universe were tailoring its messages for the occasion. For the astronomers of the time, the atmospheric explanation was too convenient to abandon. By classifying comets as weather rather than astronomy, the perfection of the celestial spheres was preserved. No need to redraw charts or revise theories. Comets could be safely relegated to the messy region of Earth's influence, joining fog, lightning and rainbows as irregular but ultimately terrestrial disturbances. The spheres above remained flawless, and the integrity of the cosmic model survived another challenge. From today's vantage point, the treatment of comets is a revealing example of how medieval science maintained stability. Rather than revising core assumptions, inconvenient observations were explained away with creative reasoning. The result was a system that could bend around the evidence without ever breaking. The comet might blaze across the sky, but in the medieval imagination, it remained nothing more than hot air. Comets may have been treated as omens of disaster, but the stars and planets were not always viewed so negatively. In medicine, they served a practical purpose. Astrological charts were routinely consulted before scheduling a treatment, especially surgery or bloodletting. The heavens in this scheme were less a theatre of unpredictable signs and more a calendar of cosmic appointments. A patient's recovery could hinge not only on the skill of the physician, but also on whether Mars or Venus happened to be in the right place at the right time. Medical astrology was formalized in diagrams known as Zodiac Men. These illustrations mapped body parts to zodiac signs. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces in the feet. A physician might glance at such a chart before opening a vein or setting a bone. The logic was that cutting into a body part under its ruling sign invited danger, while operating at a more favorable alignment improved outcomes. The stars were not decoration in this model. They were part of the patient's anatomy. Records show that even respected physicians treated the practice as routine. A surgeon asked to treat a head wound might refuse on the grounds that the moon was in Aries, preferring to wait until it moved to a less risky sign. Patients who grew impatient could always seek a second opinion, though the next doctor might deliver the same celestial excuse. The process often resembled negotiating with a very picky calendar. Astrological timing extended beyond surgery to include childbirth, dental extractions, and even the application of ointments. The stars could influence whether a salve would heal or irritate, or whether a pregnancy would succeed. For a patient, this meant that medical care was not only expensive and painful, but also occasionally delayed by astronomical bureaucracy. No wonder some conditions mysteriously improved while waiting for the stars to align. The practice was not confined to medicine alone. Courts sometimes consulted astrologers before undertaking political or military actions, treating the heavens as an advisory board. Physicians, however, brought the practice to a more intimate level, applying cosmic authority to the smallest incisions. For many, it was reassuring to believe that the universe had a timetable for healing, even if it meant postponing surgery until the next favorable conjunction. From the modern perspective, medical astrology seems more like elaborate scheduling theatre than healthcare. Yet in its own way, it fit perfectly into the broader medieval system. Just as comets were reclassified to preserve the perfection of the spheres, Astrology ensured that every earthly action harmonized with celestial order. Surgery was not just a physical intervention, it was a cosmic negotiation, balancing the knife against the stars. The reliance on horoscopes illustrates the consistent theme of medieval science: confidence first, verification later. A successful outcome was proof that the stars had been consulted correctly. A failed outcome suggested that the timing had been off, not that the theory itself was flawed. Either way, the authority of the heavens remained intact, and the patient could only hope the next alignment would be kinder. The same heavens that dictated when a physician might open a vein also instructed farmers on when to open the soil. Astrology was not confined to sick rooms. It stretched across fields and vineyards, ensuring that crops grew in harmony with the stars. Medieval handbooks gave detailed instructions on planting, pruning, and harvesting according to planetary alignments. For those who depended on the land, celestial timing was as essential as rainfall. The moon in particular held pride of place. Waxing moons were considered favorable for planting crops that grew above the ground, such as beans and cabbages, while waning moons were reserved for root vegetables. Sowing seeds during the wrong phase was believed to doom them to stunted growth or poor flavor. Farmers who ignored this advice risked more than disappointment. They risked being labeled reckless with the cosmic order. Beyond the moon, the zodiac offered further precision. Grains might thrive when planted under Virgo, while vines preferred Taurus. Agricultural calendars listed the best days for everything from shearing sheep to brewing ale, all cross-referenced against the movements of planets. The result was a farming system as much about horoscopes as about hoes. The tools of the trade included not just plows and sickles, but also charts marked with symbols of the zodiac. Astrology provided a sense of control in an uncertain world. Droughts, floods, and pests were constant threats, and there was little that human effort could do to prevent them. Believing that planting at the right alignment improved the odds made the work less daunting. A poor harvest could be blamed on unfavorable stars, while a good harvest confirmed that the calendar had been followed correctly. Either way, the system reinforced itself. Monasteries, which often owned large tracts of farmland, were enthusiastic adopters of astrological agriculture. Monks kept detailed records, not only of weather and yields, but also of planetary positions. Their manuscripts reveal a fusion of prayer, observation, and celestial scheduling. Blessings were offered in the chapel, while in the fields, planting was postponed until the moon reached a more favorable quarter. Faith and farming marched together, led by the stars. Ordinary villagers absorbed the practice in simpler forms. Folklore carried reminders of when to plant, expressed as rhymes or proverbs. A farmer might not know the technical language of astrology, but he knew to wait for the right moon before sowing his seeds. In this way, cosmic farming became part of everyday culture, even for those who had never seen a zodiac chart. From a modern perspective, much of this timing had no effect on crop success. Weather, soil, and water were far more decisive. Yet the discipline offered structure, and structure provided reassurance. Farmers could face the uncertainty of the seasons, armed with the confidence that they had followed the universe's instructions. And in the medieval world, confidence was often as valuable as truth. Astrological agriculture reveals how medieval science was less about discovering new knowledge than about maintaining cosmic harmony. Surgery, farming, and even brewing ale all operated on the same principle: follow the stars, and order will follow. Of course, not every creature in the natural world obeyed such tidy rules. Some animals refused to fit into the agricultural calendar at all, leading to more inventive explanations. The most famous of these was the barnacle goose. Astrology may have guided when to plant crops, but it could not explain every irregularity in the natural world. Some creatures simply refused to fit within neat agricultural calendars. The barnacle goose was one of them. Medieval Europeans in certain regions noticed that these geese seemed to appear seasonally without anyone witnessing their nests or eggs. The logical conclusion was that they did not breed like ordinary birds. Instead, they grew out of barnacles attached to driftwood or washed-up logs. Writers describe the process with confidence. Barnacles dangling from wood were said to resemble small birds in their early stages. Over time, they matured until eventually detaching as fully formed geese, ready to take to the air. Manuscripts included detailed illustrations, complete with shells opening to reveal tiny beaks and feathers. For those who lived far from the Arctic, where the birds actually nested, this explanation seemed to account perfectly for the mysterious arrivals. The barnacle goose belief carried practical consequences. Because the birds were thought to originate from the sea rather than from eggs, some clerics argued they should not count as ordinary meat. This loophole proved convenient during periods of fasting, when eating poultry was forbidden. Monastic communities, always attentive to dietary regulations, could enjoy roast goose under the reasoning that it was technically a kind of fish. The fact that the bird walked, honked, and otherwise behaved like a goose did not disturb the logic. It had hatched from driftwood, therefore it was seafood. Natural philosophers absorbed the claim into their broader theories. The spontaneous transformation of one thing into another fit neatly with a worldview that already accepted spontaneous generation of smaller creatures. Just as mice could supposedly spring from piles of grain or worms from rotting meat, why shouldn't geese come from barnacles? The universe was full of hidden processes, and the barnacle goose was simply one more marvel in the chain. Travelers and skeptics occasionally challenged the belief, reporting that they had seen barnacle geese nesting in the far north. But in an age when travel was slow and second-hand accounts were easy to dismiss, such objections rarely gained traction. The authoritative texts and familiar illustrations carried more weight than inconvenient reports from distant lands. The goose remained a shellfish until proven otherwise, and proof was in short supply. For modern readers, the story highlights both the creativity and the stubbornness of medieval science. Faced with incomplete information, people preferred a neat explanation that fit existing frameworks over the uncertainty of not knowing. The barnacle goose became a bird-fish hybrid, not because anyone saw the transformation occur, but because the idea filled a gap in knowledge and provided a useful loophole at the dinner table. The tale also demonstrates the close link between science and daily life. A theory was not just an abstract idea, it shaped diets, religious practice, and the rhythm of the year. Whether planting crops under the moon or dining on seafood geese during Lent, medieval Europeans lived in a world where natural philosophy reached directly into the kitchen. And the kitchen, in turn, generated its own share of scientific theories. Few examples illustrate this better than the belief that bees could be created from dead animals, a notion that gave new meaning to the phrase buzzing with life. The barnacle goose was not the only example of creatures supposedly emerging from unlikely origins. Medieval thinkers extended the same logic to insects, particularly bees. Just as birds might sprout from barnacles, bees were believed to arise from the carcasses of dead animals. Cattle were the favoured source. A rotting calf, left in the right conditions, was said to generate swarms of bees from its decaying flesh. This idea, known as bougonia, had ancient roots and was passed down faithfully through medieval manuscripts. Texts describe the process with a surprising level of instruction. Some writers advise sealing the animal in a small enclosure, breaking its body apart, and then waiting for new life to emerge. The description was not metaphorical. It was presented as a practical method, a recipe as straightforward as brewing ale or baking bread. The fact that calves produced flies, not bees, was overlooked in favour of the more appealing outcome. The association of bees with purity and order only added to the theory's appeal. Bees were admired for their structured hives, their industrious work, and the sweet product of their labour. To believe that such noble creatures emerged from the sacrifice of a calf gave the practice a symbolic weight. Death and decay transformed into sweetness and order, a neat allegory that reinforced both natural philosophy and moral teaching. Farmers and beekeepers accepted the story in varying degrees. Some may have repeated it as inherited wisdom, while others likely noticed that bees came from hives, not carcasses. Still, the theory endured in learned circles, copied into texts, and embellished with commentary. Authority once again carried the day. Aristotle had mentioned it, Virgil had written about it, and therefore the idea remained plausible, regardless of what buzzing insects actually appeared in barns and fields. The church found ways to fold the idea into sermons. Preachers used the story as a metaphor for resurrection, life emerging from death, purity from corruption. Bees became symbols not just of industry, but of divine transformation. The fact that the science was dubious mattered less than the usefulness of the image. In this sense, bougonia thrived as both natural philosophy and moral illustration, an explanation that worked in pulpits as well as in fields. From a modern perspective, the error seems obvious. The decay of animal flesh attracts flies, which lay eggs that hatch into maggots, eventually becoming adult insects. Bees have no role in this process, yet without microscopes or an understanding of reproduction, the distinction was far less clear. To a medieval observer, both flies and bees appeared suddenly around carcasses, their exact origins hidden from view. The leap from observation to conclusion was short, and once written down by an authority, it was effectively sealed. The persistence of bougonia reflects the same pattern as the barnacle goose. In the absence of clear evidence, imagination filled the gaps, and once imagination was endorsed by scholars, it hardened into fact. Both cases reveal a science more comfortable with storytelling than with testing, and in both, the natural world was expected to conform to tidy allegories, whether that meant birds growing from barnacles or bees from cattle. This tendency to treat spontaneous generation as normal extended beyond bees. Smaller creatures such as mice and worms were also thought to appear from lifeless matter, further proof that nature was constantly recycling decay into fresh populations. The idea seemed to explain infestations, even if it raised questions about why barns produced more vermin than fields. The belief that bees could emerge from the body of a dead calf was not an isolated case. Medieval thinkers extended the same principle to far less glamorous creatures. Mice, Flies, worms and lice were thought to materialize spontaneously from filth and decay. Where there was rot, there would soon be life, uninvited, unexplainable, and, in the medieval mind, entirely natural. Households provided ample evidence. Leave a sack of grain in the corner, and eventually it filled with mice. Store woolens for a season, and lice appeared. Rotting meat attracted maggots with suspicious speed. To the observer, it looked as though the creatures simply emerged from the materials themselves. Eggs and reproductive cycles were invisible to the eye, so the conclusion seemed obvious. Vermin did not breed, they erupted. Textbooks and commentaries treated this as straightforward natural philosophy. Mice, it was claimed, arose from damp straw, flies from putrid matter, and worms from the soil itself. Even frogs were occasionally said to spring from muddy banks after rain, as if the water had conjured them. The variety of examples reinforced the principle. Nature abhorred emptiness and filled decay with new forms of life. For those tasked with managing infestations, the theory was both helpful and discouraging. On one hand, it explained why efforts to keep stores clean often failed. Vermin would simply generate themselves from the materials at hand. On the other, it meant there was little point in hunting for nests or sources. Prevention was nearly impossible when your very grain sack was considered a breeding ground for new species. The medieval solution was to accept infestation as an unavoidable fact of life, and, where possible, to blame it on the larger cosmic order. Theologians found ways to turn the theory into moral teaching. Just as sin could breed corruption in the soul, filth produced corruption in the world. Vermin were reminders of human failings, their sudden appearance a punishment for negligence. Sermons did not spend much time explaining maggot biology, but they made full use of the metaphor. Mice gnawing through grain became warnings about spiritual decay, while lice were described as the physical embodiment of sloth. From a practical standpoint, the belief also justified certain agricultural practices. Farmers who burned old fields or fumigated barns believed they were destroying the very conditions that generated pests, not just removing the pests themselves. The work became less about interrupting life cycles and more about eliminating the seedbeds of corruption. The fact that these methods sometimes succeeded only reinforced the theory. Correlation was more than enough to stand in for proof. In hindsight, spontaneous generation reveals the limits of observation without careful testing. The cycle of reproduction was hidden, so imagination supplied the explanation. Once embedded in manuscripts and sermons, the idea hardened into accepted fact, persisting for centuries. Even as scholars debated finer points of cosmology and medicine, the notion that vermin could spring fully formed from filth remained unchallenged. The fascination with spontaneous creatures did not stop at vermin. Some plants and roots also acquired reputations for strange, almost supernatural properties. One of the most famous was the mandrake, a root so peculiar in shape and behavior that it inspired both medical claims and fearful legends. From vermin springing out of filth, it was only a short step to plants that behaved like people. Among the most infamous was the mandrake. This root earned a reputation not only for its medicinal value, but also for its unsettling habit of resembling the human body. Medieval texts described mandrakes as roots shaped like tiny men or women, complete with limbs, torsos, and occasionally even facial features. That resemblance alone was enough to inspire an array of stories, but the most enduring legend claimed that mandrakes screamed when uprooted, and that their scream was fatal. The supposed danger of harvesting mandrakes demanded creative techniques. One recommended method was to tie the plant to a dog and coax the animal into pulling it free. The unfortunate dog, according to the legend, would perish instantly from the root's cry, leaving the harvester safe to collect the prize. Some accounts softened the procedure, suggesting that the root should be dug at night while covering the ears with wax or reciting protective prayers. Regardless of the variation, the underlying assumption was clear. Extracting a mandrake was not a task to be taken lightly. The plant's supposed powers matched its dramatic reputation. Mandrakes were credited with curing infertility, inducing sleep, and even serving as powerful charms in love potions. Their rarity and the risks involved in harvesting them only increased their value. Apothecaries charged high prices for genuine specimens, though genuine was a flexible term. Roots of ordinary plants were often carved or trimmed to resemble human figures, sold at a premium to buyers who lacked the expertise or courage to question the authenticity. The mandrake's human-like appearance made it irresistible as a symbol. Writers and artists used it as an emblem of the blurred boundary between nature and humanity. In some texts, the mandrake was described almost as a half-plant, half-human creature, linking the vegetable world to the moral and spiritual. For theologians, it became a convenient object lesson in the dangers of desire, powerful, alluring, and deadly to those who handled it carelessly. From a practical perspective, the root did contain alkaloids with sedative and hallucinogenic effects, so its reputation was not entirely unfounded. Taken in small doses, mandrake preparations might dull pain or induce sleep. Taken in larger doses, they could cause delirium, illness, or death. The stories of fatal screams may have been exaggerated accounts of these very real dangers, wrapped in myth to discourage casual experimentation. In everyday culture, mandrakes became objects of fascination and suspicion. They appeared in collections of curiosities, were traded across regions, and occasionally turned up in court cases involving witchcraft. Owning a mandrake could enhance one's reputation as a healer or a sorcerer, depending on how charitably neighbours chose to interpret the matter. Either way, the root carried a weight of superstition that far outstripped its actual botanical qualities. The legend of the mandrake illustrates once again how medieval science merged observation, imagination, and symbolism into a single system. A root that looked vaguely human was transformed into a plant that screamed killed dogs and cured infertility, all without anyone producing reliable evidence. The pattern was familiar. Nature provided a curious detail, and human invention filled in the rest. From here, it is easy to see how other mythical creatures found a comfortable place in the same worldview. If plants could scream like humans, it required little stretch of imagination to believe in animals that breathed fire or killed with a glance. And so the medieval bestiary expanded to include dragons and basilisks, creatures that carried the same mix of authority, allegory, and fear as the mandrake itself. Once a root could scream and kill a dog, it was hardly a leap to imagine animals with even more impressive abilities. Medieval natural philosophy devoted generous attention to creatures like dragons and basilisks, beasts that straddled the line between zoology and mythology. They were described in the same tone as lions or bears, with none of the hesitation one might expect when cataloguing animals that breathed fire or killed with a glance. Dragons were the larger and more versatile of the two. Accounts described them as enormous reptiles, often winged, hoarding treasure, and sometimes exhaling flames. Their presence was accepted across bestiaries and chronicles, often accompanied by woodcuts that looked suspiciously like oversized snakes with wings pasted on. To scholars, the dragon embodied both the dangers of the natural world and the allegories of the spiritual one. It could represent Satan, greed, or the chaos of untamed nature, depending on the author's needs. The fact that no villager had ever produced a dragon carcass was treated as a minor inconvenience, one that did not outweigh centuries of authoritative repetition. The basilisk, though smaller, enjoyed a reputation even more lethal. Roughly described as a serpent with a crown-shaped crest, it was said to possess the power to kill with a mere glance or with its poisonous breath. Writers elaborated that no creature could stand against it, except the humble weasel, whose smell or bite could destroy the basilisk instantly. Why the cosmos had balanced a king of serpents against a ferret-sized opponent was never fully explained, but the story circulated with confidence. Practical advice for handling these creatures occasionally appeared in texts. Travelers were cautioned not to stare directly at a basilisk, which seems sensible advice even without believing in them. Dragons, meanwhile, were said to be vulnerable to lances, saints, or particularly determined knights. Many legends placed dragons near water sources, explaining their presence as both a danger to livestock and a test of human courage. For readers, the message was clear. Such beasts might exist on the margins of maps, but they could be slain by the virtuous. Theologians, unsurprisingly, seized on these animals for moral lessons. The dragon could symbolize sin or heresy, vast and consuming, while the basilisk stood for corruption so subtle it could kill with a look. Sermons delivered these images with confidence, knowing that no parishioner would dare question the zoology. After all, bestiaries were not just storybooks. They were educational tools, copied and illuminated by monks who believed themselves cataloguing the full range of creation. From a modern standpoint, dragons and basilisks illustrate how medieval science absorbed mythology rather than distinguishing it from empirical study. To the scholars compiling bestiaries, it made little difference whether a creature was observed in the wild or inherited from legend. Both had their place in the grand order of nature, and both could be used to instruct and inspire. The fascination with fantastical beasts carried the same logic as mandrakes. Unusual details demanded explanation, and explanations that reinforced moral or spiritual lessons were favored over skepticism. The result was a natural history that treated screaming roots, treasure-hoarding reptiles, and glance-killing serpents as equally valid entries. Yet not every supposed threat came from exotic creatures. Some dangers were far more ordinary, tied not to mythical monsters, but to the air itself. Among the most persistent beliefs was that foul odors carried disease, a theory that shaped medieval responses to plague and pestilence long before bacteria were imagined. The terror inspired by dragons and basilisks may have filled manuscripts, but for ordinary people, the more pressing menace was invisible and everywhere: bad air. While mythical beasts lurked at the edges of maps, the miasma theory placed danger in every breath. According to this view, disease spread through corrupted air, thick with decay, rot, or celestial misalignment. Illness was not transmitted from person to person, but floated in noxious clouds, waiting to strike the unlucky. The logic fit neatly into the medieval worldview. People noticed that plagues often followed foul smells, swamps, sewers, or overcrowded streets. Without microscopes to show bacteria or viruses, the conclusion was that the stench itself was the agent of disease. The nose became a diagnostic tool. A foul odor was not just unpleasant, but actively dangerous, a sign that corruption was present in the air and therefore inescapably in the body. Authorities took the theory seriously enough to shape policy. Cities organized teams of rakers to clear refuse, not because sanitation improved health in a modern sense, but because it reduced the strength of the smell. Civic leaders ordered the relocation of butchers, tanners, and other pungent trades to the edges of town. The aim was to keep the central air clean, or at least less offensively corrupted. The result sometimes worked by accident, lowering exposure to genuine sources of infection, though credit was always given to the absence of stench. During epidemics, households and physicians fought miasma with scent. People burned fragrant woods, carried pomanders filled with herbs, and waved posies under their noses. The logic was to overwhelm the bad air with stronger, better air. For those unable to afford exotic spices, the solutions grew more creative. Some recommended vinegar-soaked cloths, others advised garlic necklaces. A few even suggested that particularly foul odors, such as sewage, could drive out milder forms of corruption, a method that replaced one hazard with another. The fear of miasma also influenced architecture. Wealthy households built large windows and encouraged airflow, believing that moving air dispersed corruption. Monasteries recorded wind patterns and timed their activities to coincide with favorable breezes. Ventilation, at least in principle, became a form of medical treatment, even if it amounted to opening a window and hoping for the best. The theory endured not just because it fit observation, but because it supported moral lessons. Bad smells equated to bad behavior. Sin and neglect bred corruption, which then bred disease. Sermons reinforced the link. A foul city was not only unhealthy, but spiritually compromised. Cleaning the streets could therefore be framed as both civic hygiene and religious duty, giving everyone an extra reason to participate, though enthusiasm for latrine duty was probably limited. In hindsight, miasma theory was wrong in its details, but occasionally effective in its outcomes. Clearing waste, isolating foul industries, and ventilating buildings sometimes reduced genuine sources of contagion. That the reasoning was flawed mattered less than the results. People believed they were combating poisoned air, but in reality, they were unknowingly disrupting bacterial breeding grounds. Even in error, the system managed a few accidental successes. The persistence of miasma shows the same tendency that sustained dragons, mandrakes, and barnacle geese, a preference for explanations that were visible, moral, and comforting, even when inaccurate. And yet, unlike mythical beasts, miasma had the advantage of being everywhere, offering a constant reminder that corruption was always near. Still, not every illness was traced to the air. Some conditions were considered moral punishments directly tied to sin, with leprosy serving as the most striking example. The conviction that foul air spread disease was persuasive, but it did not explain every illness. Some conditions were judged too visible, too shameful, and too persistent to be blamed on vapors alone. Leprosy, in particular, was seen not just as a medical problem, but as a moral one. To medieval minds, the disease was a punishment from God, visited upon those guilty of sin. The lesions on the skin were not random, they were marks of spiritual corruption written on the body itself. Chroniclers described lepers in tones that blended medical observation with sermonizing. Their skin was pale or mottled, their nerves dulled, their faces disfigured, and every symptom was treated as both diagnosis and metaphor. Physicians might prescribe ointments, baths, or dietary changes, but these efforts were often half-hearted, since the prevailing belief was that the condition came from divine judgment rather than humoral imbalance. Medicine could dabble at the surface, but only repentance could cure the soul. Communities responded with a mixture of fear and ritual. Lepers were often required to wear special clothing, carry a bell or clapper to announce their approach, and live apart in leper houses or colonies on the edge of town. These measures were justified as protection against contagion, though the symbolic message was equally strong. Sinners were being set apart. Isolation was treatment and punishment at once. To a passerby, the sound of a leper's bell was a reminder of both disease and divine wrath, a kind of mobile sermon with auditory effects. The church institutionalized the stigma. Ceremonies for admitting a leper into isolation resembled funerals, complete with prayers that treated the patient as though already half dead. The individual was removed from ordinary society and placed under spiritual supervision, reminded that their suffering was both deserved and instructional. The arrangement reinforced the idea that moral failing and physical illness were inseparable. The association with sin also influenced law. Lepers were sometimes barred from testifying in court, inheriting property, or participating in markets. Their condition rendered them socially invisible, while keeping them conspicuously audible with their clappers. This contradiction, excluded yet always noticed, reflected the uneasy mix of pity and suspicion that framed medieval attitudes toward the disease. In some cases, leprosy was even linked to specific categories of sin. Lust, greed, and pride were all named as potential causes, though evidence was never requested. A wealthy merchant who lost his fortune and developed lesions could serve as a public example of divine justice, proof that prosperity without piety invited retribution. The afflicted body became a kind of warning billboard, as though God were posting announcements in human skin. From today's standpoint, the treatment of leprosy reveals how thoroughly morality permeated medieval science. Where miasma theory saw invisible corruption in the air, the doctrine of leprosy saw corruption in the person. Both explanations relied on the same pattern: make the unseen visible and assign it a cause that reinforced existing beliefs. Yet medieval medicine did not stop with moral judgments alone. Remedies continued to be sought, some of them oddly creative, others distinctly hazardous. Among the more striking examples was the use of mercury, not as a metal for coins or alchemy, but as a substance swallowed, applied, and inhaled in the hope of restoring health. Once illness was framed as both a punishment and a mystery, treatments tended to follow unusual paths. Among the most striking was the use of mercury, a substance admired for its shine, its weight, and its ability to move like a liquid metal. To medieval physicians, these qualities made it a natural candidate for medicine. After all, a material so strange and rare surely contained powerful properties, and anything powerful might as well be applied to the human body. Mercury appeared in a range of preparations. Some healers prescribed it in ointments, rubbed onto the skin to draw out impurities. Others recommended swallowing small amounts, on the logic that what scoured and transformed metals in an alchemist's flask might do the same inside the body. Vapor treatments were also attempted, with patients encouraged to inhale the fumes for their supposed restorative effects. That mercury was toxic did not escape notice entirely, but its toxicity was often reinterpreted as strength. A cure, it was argued, had to be powerful enough to do damage. Otherwise, what good was it? The element was especially popular in treating skin conditions, including leprosy and later syphilis. Mercury ointments were believed to purge corruption, restoring balance to the humours by forcing impurities to the surface. The burning, blistering, and occasional poisoning that resulted were treated as signs of progress. Pain was considered evidence that the treatment was working. Recovery was less consistent, but physicians rarely blamed the remedy. They simply concluded that the disease had been too advanced or that the dosage had been insufficiently heroic. Alchemists further encouraged the practice by weaving mercury into their theories of transformation. In their view, just as mercury could combine with other metals to create new forms, so it might combine with the human body to bring renewal. Some even suggested it was a vital ingredient in the elusive elixir of life. Patients desperate for relief were willing to believe it, especially when the alternative was a slow decline with no other treatment in sight. The use of mercury also reflected the broader medieval confidence in substances that shock the senses. Garlic, vinegar, smoke, and sewage had already been drafted into service against plague. Compared to those, a gleaming liquid metal seemed almost sophisticated. Its rarity and cost added to the appeal, transforming each dose into a demonstration of wealth as well as medical hope. To be treated with mercury was to signal both one's resources and one's determination to survive. Modern readers, of course, recoil at the thought. Mercury poisoning damages nerves, organs, and the brain, hardly the hallmarks of recovery. Yet in a period where trial and error was the only research method available, mercury's dramatic effects seemed to validate its power. A patient who survived might appear improved, at least temporarily, while those who declined provided no further objections. In this way, the practice endured for centuries, its failures explained away, and its supposed successes amplified. The story of mercury as medicine demonstrates once again how medieval science prized intensity over accuracy. Remedies were judged by how forcefully they acted, not by whether they cured. A treatment that caused visible reactions was trusted more than one that produced subtle changes. Mercury delivered reactions in abundance, guaranteeing it a place in the physician's arsenal. This reliance on extraordinary substances fed directly into the larger obsession with alchemy, where metals, stones, and elixirs promised not just cures, but transformation itself. And at the center of that fascination stood the ultimate quest, the search for eternal life through alchemical means. Mercury's reputation as a medicinal substance was only one part of a much larger ambition. To alchemists, it was not merely a treatment, but a hint, evidence that matter itself might be coaxed into transformation. This belief expanded beyond curing leprosy or fevers and reached for something far greater, the conquest of death. The philosopher's stone promised to change lead into gold, but the same stone was also said to produce the elixir of life, a liquid capable of granting health, longevity, and possibly immortality. The idea was irresistible. In a world where disease, famine, and war shortened lives, the promise of eternal youth was more than a curiosity. It was a mission. Alchemists recorded elaborate recipes, often blending metals, herbs, and mystical symbols into a slurry of instruction. The directions rarely made sense in practical terms, but they were cloaked in allegory: suns marrying moons, kings uniting with queens, serpents devouring their tails. For believers, these cryptic phrases were not nonsense, but coded wisdom. The secret was hidden for those clever enough or persistent enough to unlock it. Wealthy patrons were willing to sponsor the work. Rulers facing fragile dynasties or failing health had little to lose by keeping an alchemist on retainer. Some courts became laboratories, their chambers filled with the smell of smoke, the clatter of bellows, and the endless churning of crucibles. Alchemists reassured their sponsors that progress was being made, though progress often meant yet another round of experiments that turned gold coins into ash. A monarch might die without receiving the elixir, but the next monarch usually renewed the funding. Hope, like Mercury, was difficult to extinguish. Beyond politics, the pursuit of immortality carried a philosophical dimension. Alchemy was not simply about extending lifespan, but about achieving harmony between the material and the spiritual. The elixir of life was thought to perfect both body and soul, aligning humanity with divine order. In this way, drinking the elixir was not just survival, it was transcendence. That no elixir was ever successfully produced did little to dim enthusiasm. The mere possibility was enough to keep furnaces glowing. For the broader population, the obsession trickled down in the form of folk remedies and traveling healers selling diluted versions of the dream. Bottles labeled as life-extending potions circulated in markets, containing mixtures of herbs, alcohol, or occasionally substances better suited to cleaning metal than nourishing a body. Buyers may not have achieved immortality, but they did achieve indigestion, which at least provided proof that the potion was potent. In retrospect, the alchemical chase for eternal life illustrates the same confidence that fueled Mercury cures. Intensity equaled legitimacy. A bitter taste, a burning sensation, or a dramatic vision during ingestion was taken as a sign of authenticity. In truth, the only thing immortal was the belief itself, persisting for centuries through manuscripts, laboratories, and sermons. The dream of defeating death ultimately faded as medicine advanced and alchemy gave way to chemistry. Yet the pursuit left behind more than scorched crucibles and disappointed kings. It also cemented the conviction that extraordinary cures required extraordinary substances. That conviction extended beyond metals and potions into stranger practices still, such as placing live animals in uncomfortable proximity to the human skull in the hope of curing what ailed the mind. The same mindset that believed metals could be coaxed into gold and elixirs brewed into immortality also produced treatments that seem astonishingly strange today. Among them was the practice of placing live toads against the human skull to treat illness, particularly neurological complaints such as headaches, epilepsy, or madness. In the medieval imagination, the toad was not merely an unpleasant creature from damp places, but a vessel of absorbing power, capable of drawing poisons and corruptions out of the body. Medical texts describe the procedure with complete seriousness. A toad, preferably captured fresh from the mud, was bound or placed in close contact with the patient's head. The idea was that the animal's cold, clammy nature would attract and extract the excess heat or venom believed to cause fits and convulsions. In some cases, dried toad parts were powdered and applied to the scalp or mixed into potions, but the live animal was considered most effective, as though its vitality could actively wrestle with the corruption inside the skull. The practice was not limited to seizures. Toads were also recommended for treating swelling, fevers, and even toothache. One popular belief held that carrying a dried toad in a pouch around the neck would ward off illness entirely. Apothecaries occasionally sold small bags of toad bones as protective charms, offering customers both medical security and an accessory guaranteed to start conversations. The symbolism behind this method was important. The toad had long been associated with poison and filth, so it made a fitting adversary for disease. Just as one might fight fire with fire, medieval physicians proposed fighting corruption with a creature steeped in it. The patient, covered in sweating cloths and crowned with a toad, may not have felt better, but the treatment offered a sense that action was being taken. And in a medical culture that valued demonstration over outcome, action counted for a great deal. Not all reactions to the practice were approving. Some chroniclers mocked the reliance on toads as desperate and undignified, proof that medicine had strayed into the ridiculous. Others defended it as evidence of nature's hidden balance, where even lowly animals had roles to play in maintaining human health. The lack of consistent results was conveniently overlooked. If a patient improved, the toad was praised. If the patient declined, the disease was judged too strong. Either way, the theory remained intact. From a modern perspective, the treatment had no biological foundation, though it did sometimes produce an effect, namely revulsion. The sheer unpleasantness of the therapy might have distracted patients from their original symptoms, a form of medieval placebo. It also reinforced the theme that medicine was not meant to be comfortable. Remedies that stank, burned, or crawled were often considered the most reliable. The toad cure demonstrates once again how medieval science mixed observation, symbolism, and confidence into equal parts. Amphibians were associated with dampness, corruption, and poison. Diseases of the head seemed equally corrupting. Therefore, the one could cure the other. It was a chain of reasoning that required no experiment, only imagination. This tendency to assign healing properties to unlikely objects extended beyond animals. Stones and minerals, with their colors, shapes, and supposed mystical properties, were catalogued and prescribed just as earnestly. The result was a flourishing belief in the curative powers of gemstones, a medical practice that sparkled with confidence even as it lacked evidence. From the clammy grip of toads, medieval science turned towards something far more appealing: stones that gleamed and sparkled. Gemstones were thought to hold powerful medicinal properties, their colors and rarity taken as proof of hidden virtues. Where the toad embodied damp corruption, jewels represented purity and strength. Both were believed to channel natural forces. Only one looked considerably better on a necklace. Medical and lapidary texts catalogued the supposed effects of different stones with great precision. Sapphires, cool and blue, were recommended for eye diseases. Emeralds were credited with sharpening memory and relieving stress, while diamonds promised courage and protection from nightmares. Rubies, with their deep red hue, were linked to vitality and circulation. In each case, the logic was consistent. Appearance revealed function. A stone's color, shape, or shine was interpreted as a clue to the ailment it could cure. The methods of application varied. Some stones were worn as jewelry, allowing their properties to seep gradually into the body. Others were ground into powders and mixed into drinks or ointments, an approach that combined prestige with the risk of indigestion. Wealthy patients could afford to swallow tiny shavings of precious gems, a treatment that was as uncomfortable for the stomach as it was for the family treasury. Less affluent patients made do with cheaper minerals, which conveniently were said to be less potent, but still serviceable. Gemstones also featured prominently in amulets. A patient might carry a small pouch containing stones selected for their condition, effectively wearing a portable pharmacy around the neck. Clergy sometimes blessed these amulets, merging medical and spiritual authority into a single glittering charm. A child wearing an amber necklace might be said to avoid fevers, while a soldier with a ruby talisman was thought to resist wounds. Results were mixed, but enthusiasm remained steady. The belief was not confined to Europe. Texts from Arabic and Persian scholars influenced medieval European thought, describing the healing properties of stones alongside astronomical observations. Trade routes ensured that exotic gems reached the hands of physicians and collectors, reinforcing the sense that the farther a stone had travelled, the stronger its power must be. A local pebble might be fine for a headache, but for serious ailments only a sapphire from the east would do. To modern eyes, the practice appears fanciful, yet it carried an internal consistency. Just as humors shaped health and stars shaped destiny, so too did stones radiate their influence. The fact that gems were rare and beautiful only increased their credibility. Painful treatments like toads or mercury demonstrated power through discomfort, while gemstones demonstrated it through expense. Either way, patients were persuaded that something potent was at work. The fascination with healing stones shows how medieval science often blurred the line between observation, symbolism, and luxury. A jewel could be medicine, ornament, and moral lesson all at once. A diamond was not just valuable, it was a bulwark against fear. Whether it worked or not was beside the point. The important thing was that it looked convincing while doing nothing at all. From the glitter of gemstones, it was only a short conceptual step to the unseen forces they supposedly embodied. Natural disasters, like storms and lightning, were also explained through invisible powers. When crops failed or ships sank, the cause was rarely chance. Instead, weather itself was thought to bend under the influence of sorcery and intention, ushering in the medieval belief that storms could be conjured by witchcraft. From gemstones that supposedly radiated invisible energies, it was a natural step to imagine that larger natural forces could also be manipulated. The weather, unpredictable and destructive, seemed too important to leave to chance. Medieval communities often explained sudden storms, ruined harvests, or shipwrecks not as random misfortune, but as the result of witchcraft. Someone, somewhere, must have conjured the clouds. Chroniclers describe villagers who swore that neighbours had raised tempests with a curse or a gesture. The suspicion often fell on outsiders or on those already regarded with unease, herbalists, widows, or anyone unusually reclusive. When hail flattened fields or lightning struck barns, it was easier to believe in human malice than in indifferent skies. Weather became another battlefield of moral struggle, where divine order could be disrupted by human wickedness. The belief was supported by occasional coincidences. A quarrel with a neighbour followed by a ruined crop seemed too perfectly aligned to dismiss. Fishermen who angered someone on shore and then lost nets in a storm had their misfortune neatly explained. Tales of witches selling favourable winds to sailors circulated widely, complete with descriptions of knotted ropes that, when untied, released breezes of varying strength. A sailor might purchase a gentle wind for safe passage, or in a moment of regret, discover he had loosed a gale. Authorities treated the matter seriously. Trials for weather magic appear in legal records, with confessions extracted under pressure and punishments carried out in the belief that justice was protecting the community from further storms. In these proceedings, natural philosophy merged with law and theology, transforming meteorology into a matter for the courts. Whether a storm destroyed crops because of atmospheric instability or because of whispered incantations was not a question most judges entertained. The Church reinforced the association between bad weather and bad behavior. Priests reminded congregations that sin could provoke divine anger, which might manifest as storms, floods, or droughts. The line between divine punishment and human sorcery was often blurry, allowing nearly any disaster to be framed as both warning and judgment. For communities desperate for explanations, this overlap was comforting. Someone or something was responsible. From today's perspective, weather by witchcraft illustrates the same reliance on symbolism that shaped gemstone cures. Both assumed that hidden forces governed the visible world, and both assigned human actors the ability to direct those forces. A glittering amulet protected an individual, while a whispered curse might devastate a village. In each case, the unseen was treated as not only real, but decisive. Despite the lack of evidence, the belief persisted for centuries, shaping both everyday suspicion and broader policy. Sailors continued to buy bottled winds. Farmers continued to eye their neighbours nervously after failed harvests, and courts continued to prosecute the unlucky. The weather may not have obeyed witchcraft, but witchcraft certainly explained the weather. From here, it is not surprising that other natural disasters received similar treatment. Storms might be attributed to sorcery, but earthquakes, sudden, violent, and destructive, were almost universally regarded as the unmistakable wrath of God shaking the very ground beneath human feet. Storms could be blamed on witches, but when the ground itself shifted, no human culprit seemed sufficient. Earthquakes were far too powerful to be credited to spells or incantations. Instead, they were interpreted as unmistakable signs of divine displeasure. When the earth trembled, it was God himself shaking creation to remind humanity of its fragility and sin. Chroniclers recorded earthquakes with solemn commentary, rarely focusing on the physical damage. The emphasis was on the moral meaning. A city wall collapsing was not just an architectural failure. It was evidence that the community had strayed. A monastery cracking apart was a reminder that even holy places were not immune to divine correction. In many accounts, the quake itself received less attention than the sermon that inevitably followed. The explanations varied, but all returned to spiritual themes. Some writers described the earth groaning under the weight of sin, unable to bear corruption any longer. Others imagined subterranean fires kindled by divine anger, shaking the crust until repentance was demanded. Astrological speculations sometimes crept in, suggesting that planetary alignments triggered the tremors, though even then the alignments were treated as instruments of providence. The underlying message never changed. Earthquakes were moral lessons written into the landscape. Public reactions reflected the gravity of the interpretation. Fasts and processions were organized in the aftermath, with entire towns called to confess sins and beg for mercy. Bells rang, not to warn of aftershocks, but to summon communities to prayer. The tremors were considered warnings rather than random events, opportunities to correct behavior before greater calamities arrived. For people accustomed to viewing storms as curses and illness as punishment, the quake was simply judgment on a grander scale. The destruction caused by earthquakes reinforced the lesson. Collapsed houses and shattered churches were visible proof that no amount of wealth or status provided protection. Everyone, from noble to peasant, felt the ground shift beneath them in the same way. This equality of danger lent the events a strange credibility, as if God were temporarily flattening the hierarchy to make his point clear. From a practical standpoint, no preventive measures existed. Walls could be rebuilt, but there was no equivalent of carrying herbs or wearing gemstones to ward off earthquakes. The only available defense was spiritual preparation, confession, repentance, and public displays of piety. Communities leaned heavily on these rituals, convinced that sincere contrition might calm the earth itself. Modern readers may search in vain for geology in these accounts. Fault lines and tectonic plates were centuries away from explanation. For medieval science, the priority was not to understand the mechanism, but to assign meaning. The quake was a message, not a natural phenomenon. To analyze it otherwise would have seemed not only futile but impious. By treating earthquakes as divine wrath, medieval thinkers maintained the pattern of linking every disaster to morality. Storms and comets could be managed through ritual or astrology, but earthquakes were beyond negotiation. They reminded everyone that beneath their feet lay forces that only God could command. Yet even as the ground itself was declared a message, attention soon returned to the body, where celestial signs and earthly ailments were woven together in a single figure, the Zodiac Man, who mapped the stars directly onto human flesh. After watching the earth split and shake under what they assumed was God's hand, medieval physicians had little trouble believing that the same cosmic forces reached into the human body. The same heavens that rattled cities could, on a smaller scale, rattle bones and humours. This idea found its clearest expression in the Zodiac Man, a figure that mapped each sign of the zodiac to a particular body part. Astrology and medicine merged so seamlessly that consulting the stars before performing a treatment became as routine as sharpening a blade. The diagram was easy to understand. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, Cancer the chest, and so on, marching down the body until Pisces claimed the feet. In effect, the human form became a celestial chart, a kind of astrological spreadsheet rendered in flesh. Physicians referenced these maps constantly. A toothache under Taurus, wait for the stars to shift before pulling. A leg wound when Sagittarius was dominant. Best delay treatment unless you enjoyed tempting fate. This framework gave physicians both confidence and flexibility. Successes were credited to proper timing, while failures were explained away as unfortunate alignments. Patients could hardly argue. A recovery meant the stars had smiled, while a decline meant the heavens were stern. Either way, the physician had been correct to consult the chart. Medicine was transformed into a cosmic negotiation, where scalpels and ointments worked only in cooperation with the skies. Astrological medicine also found its way into everyday routines. Almanacs circulated widely, filled with instructions on when to bleed, when to bathe, even when to cut one's hair. The belief that the stars influenced bodily fluids gave rise to strict calendars for personal care. A patient might dutifully wait until the moon shifted into a more favorable sign before submitting to bloodletting, trusting that the heavens preferred a tidy schedule. The system was reassuring, if not exactly efficient. The church offered a mixed response. Some clerics tolerated astrology as a tool for understanding divine order, while others condemned it as dangerously close to heresy. Still, the diagrams continued to appear in manuscripts, copied in careful detail by monks who clearly saw no contradiction between charting the heavens and illuminating sacred texts. The Zodiac Man stood beside saints and martyrs in the same volumes, a reminder that in the medieval imagination, medicine and theology were rarely separate. For patients, the result was a medical system that felt both grand and personal. Their bodies were literally aligned with the stars, their ailments woven into the cosmic drama. A broken arm was not just an accident, but an event with celestial significance. The treatment, guided by planets, was not just physical, but philosophical. It may not have increased survival rates, but it did provide meaning, and meaning was often more comforting than medicine itself. The reliance on astrology in medicine underscores the final theme running through medieval science. Knowledge was less about testing and more about trusting. Observations, symbols, and authorities were arranged into orderly systems, each as confident as the last. That confidence, copied and recopied through centuries, was the true foundation of medieval learning. And as the long chain of beliefs shows, from unicorn horns to astrological surgery, it was confidence, not evidence, that gave the period its enduring character. Which leads naturally to the last and perhaps most telling piece of the puzzle: the reliance on authority itself, the bedrock upon which every mistaken certainty rested. The Zodiac Man made clear how thoroughly medieval science wove the body into the cosmos, but beneath every chart and theory lay a deeper principle. Knowledge was trusted because it came from authority. Whether the claim was about stars controlling surgery, salamanders living in fire, or barnacle geese sprouting from driftwood, the crucial detail was not evidence but authorship. Aristotle had said it, Galen had written it, Pliny had hinted at it, therefore it was true. In practice, this meant that libraries were treated more like vaults of certainty than laboratories of curiosity. Students memorized passages, monks copied texts, and scholars lectured by reciting authorities word for word. To question a passage was not simply to ask a scientific question, it was to undermine the weight of centuries. The safest course was always repetition. Better to preserve a mistake in ink than to risk correcting an ancient master. This reliance on authority also explained how so many improbable ideas persisted. The notion that women had fewer teeth than men, or that mandrakes screamed, survived not because anyone verified them, but because they had been written down by someone important. A single authoritative voice could echo through generations, drowning out observation and common sense. Counting teeth was simple. Defying Aristotle was unthinkable. The system had its advantages. Authority created stability, ensuring that knowledge was preserved through centuries of upheaval. It also gave scholars a ready-made framework for teaching, sparing them the difficulty of constant reinvention. In a world without printing presses or mass communication, clinging to authoritative texts provided continuity, but the cost of stability was stagnation. New discoveries had little chance to flourish if they conflicted with established voices. The safest innovation was no innovation at all. For the average person, this meant that medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy remained remarkably consistent over centuries. Physicians might disagree on the finer points of humoral balance or planetary influence, but all operated within the same inherited boundaries. The question was not what could be observed, but which authority best explained the observation. Scholars competed in commentary rather than in experiment, producing layers of gloss on top of the same core texts. In retrospect, it is striking how little evidence was required to sustain a belief. A casual remark in an ancient manuscript could grow into a universally accepted fact, endlessly copied in new volumes. Once written, knowledge hardened into doctrine, and doctrine into unquestionable truth. The medieval student learned not to probe, but to repeat, not to test, but to trust. Yet this unquestioning reverence also set the stage for eventual change. When Renaissance scholars began to challenge the old authorities, they did so by rediscovering the value of direct observation. Telescopes, dissections, and experiments slowly displaced commentaries. The old systems did not collapse overnight, but once the monopoly of authority was broken, new knowledge began to flow. For the medieval period, however, authority remained king. It bound unicorn horns, humors, comets, mandrakes, dragons, and even human anatomy into a single coherent framework. Coherent because it was consistent, not because it was correct. In that sense, medieval science was less about discovery and more about confidence. And while it was frequently wrong, it was rarely uncertain. And so we arrive at the end of our long and unnecessarily detailed tour through the scientific convictions of the Middle Ages. We have journeyed from unicorn horns to screaming roots, from barnacle geese to basilisk stairs, from humors to horoscopes. At every step, the pattern remained the same. Confidence first, evidence later, sometimes centuries later. What stands out is not how wrong these ideas were, but how consistently they were maintained. Authority was trusted, observations were bent to fit the theory, and theories were bent to fit theology. It was a world where counting teeth could destabilize philosophy, where toads were medical devices, and where comets were blamed for everything short of bad cooking. For the medieval scholar, all of this formed a coherent system. For us, it forms the perfect subject for the Boring Files saga, a saga not of triumph, but of persistence. Because while truth eventually won, the wrong ideas had the longer run. As always, thank you for enduring this episode of the Boring Files saga. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment that will thoroughly confuse the historians of the future. They will wonder why thousands of people voluntarily listened to a 2-hour lecture on mandrakes, geese, and humors. We will know the answer. Because boredom, delivered in sufficient quantity, is strangely comforting. Until next time, may your humors remain balanced, your barnacle geese stay firmly in the sea, and your gemstones do absolutely nothing at all. This has been the Boring Files saga, what medieval scientists actually believed. Good night.